Hello, people. My name's Dominic Boyd. I work with the Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia. My current role with them is Education and Outreach Coordinator for Pictou County, Antigonish County, and Guysborough County. I have over 30 years of experience as a social worker, including 13 years in the mental health field. It's my pleasure today to bring to you a presentation about handling strong emotions as caregivers. I can say at the outset that I had the experience of assisting my mother as she went through her journey with dementia. She passed away a few years ago now, but it was a great help to me that I was involved with the Alzheimer's Society support group. I did find some of these strong emotions that we're going to talk about today were things that occurred with me, which I had to learn how to handle, so I can speak from experience. So why might we concern ourselves with handling strong emotions? We know that caregivers have a very difficult role at times. Sometimes there's surprises. Sometimes the person with dementia will behave in ways that we weren't foreseeing or that are persistent and difficult for us. And we can definitely have some strong feelings. They can be very difficult to handle at times. We also know that emotions are capable of overwhelming the more rational part of our brain. Emotions come from what we call the old brain, and the rational part is more from the new brain, which developed with us as Homo sapiens, and it's a more recent development. So the emotions are sometimes difficult. So we're going to talk today about what emotions can be difficult for us and how can we actually handle them. As I was saying, we can feel overwhelmed at times, and it can take a little while to kind of get our equilibrium back. What are emotions? Our emotions are what drive us to achieve our goals and enable us to live a rich life. They're a big part of who we are. As I mentioned, they do predate the more rational part of our mind. Emotions exist for reasons. They can warn us, they can protect us, they can enable us to feel close to others, they can help us find fulfillment in life. Emotions can, unfortunately, also lead to negative behavior. And our emotions will crop up a great deal in how we treat and deal with the person with dementia. So we're going to take a moment and just look at some basic steps for handling emotions. It's helpful to remember that emotions occur like a wave. They start, and then they sort of build, and then they crest, they hit a peak, and then they begin to dissipate or to slowly dissolve. And if we remember that, when the feeling, whatever the feeling is that comes, especially if it's a difficult feeling, it helps to be mindful and take a few breaths and just allow ourselves to expect that the emotion will crest, it will pass in time. It's also helpful to just to simply observe and accept those feelings. So for instance, if I'm feeling anxious, I can just observe that and just say, I'm anxious, or I feel anxious, or I can simply say anxiety. And accept it. I don't have to push the feeling away. I don't have to tell myself it's bad for having that feeling. I can just simply accept that it is a feeling. Feelings as in and of themselves are just natural phenomena. They're not good or bad. They just are. Handling emotions is also expedited when we think about what can we do with those feelings? How can we use them in a productive way? How can they help me to get through a situation or resolve a problem, what have you? We can do things like talk about our feelings. We can write about our feelings, maybe write a poem or a little story or just a letter to ourselves or a letter to somebody else. We can do creative things like painting. We can do physical things like exercising. I know for me, sometimes when I've gotten mad at something, I pick up a broom and give the floor a good sweep. And that helps me to deal with those feelings. And it actually does something positive as well, where the floor gets cleaned. Another piece of this, if we're going to express feelings, is to own the emotion. So to simply say, I feel such and such, and I'm responsible for that, or I own that. I feel angry, and I own that. I feel sad, I own that, etc. I'm not blaming anyone else for my particular feeling. I'm taking responsibility for it. We can be compassionate to ourselves and gentle. This means to treat ourselves as if we were our own best friend. It means being kind to ourselves, recognizing that whatever we're feeling is difficult and that it's real and it's okay. And if we're struggling or if we're feeling pain about something, that's okay too. And as mentioned, taking responsibility for our feelings. So there are triggers in our daily lives, and we can feel something responding or to those stimuli, whatever those triggers are. But at the same time, we have the responsibility of dealing with the feelings that arise in us. They are our feelings, and we need to take responsibility for them. Other people can't fix our feelings, in other words. So what kinds of feelings typically can surface in dementia? And these are particularly feelings that can give us some trouble. I've named 5 of them here, and there may be others, but these are some that I've observed over time and I'd like to talk about today. So guilt, grief, anger, shame, and feelings of stress and burnout. And I'd like to include anxiety in that one. So for today, we're going to look at guilt. Guilt is a very common emotion among caregivers, and it usually relates to something that I did or something that I didn't do, acts of omission or commission. Guilt and all of our feelings exist in us for reasons. In other words, they are there to help us or to assist us in managing situations. Guilt can be used productively. It can motivate a person to reconcile with somebody if they've harmed them. It can also motivate us to make changes and improve behavior. Guilt needs to be based on a realistic appraisal of the situation. In other words, did I actually do something that harmed the other person, or did I just imagine it? And there has to be some reason, in other words, for feeling guilty. Sometimes people make themselves feel guilty in an unfair way, and they're not really guilty of whatever they're accusing themselves of. There's also non-productive guilt, and that's about living in the past, and one can ruminate. One can go in circles, and unfortunately nothing is lost, nothing is learned, and the person will feel stuck. They'll go over and over whatever it is that they're concerned about. And they will say things like, why did I do that? I'm an idiot for doing that, and things like that. And they aren't actually learning, and nothing is changing. It's just making the person feel bad. So what are some common issues that can occur when dealing with guilt? We can feel guilty for any number of reasons, but when we think about the caregiving role, we can recognize that it can come from getting angry at somebody. Supposing the person with dementia keeps talking over and over in the same pattern, maybe asking, what time is it? What time is it? What time is it? Have I had my pill? Have I had my pill? Have I had my pill? Sometimes people get tired of hearing that, and they might get angry. They might find that they're unable to keep a promise that they made, and therefore they feel guilty. They may have promised that they would never put their mother or father into a home, and unfortunately, situations changed, and they did end up doing that. And they then feel guilty that they couldn't keep that promise. It can be also that they're not visiting the person sufficient number of times, they're not visiting frequently enough. They may feel guilty about asking for help to come into the home. The person with dementia may be angry about that and may take it out on the caregiver. Feeling over-responsible. In other words, feeling that you got to do it all yourself. Sometimes people can fall into that. It's a bit of a trap, and it's certainly something to be very careful about. We can feel pulled in different directions. Unfortunately, there can be all sorts of demands on a person. If you take a caregiver who's maybe in their 50s and they have children who are, maybe around 20 years old or something like that, those children will pull the caregiver in a certain direction. There could be a spouse and feeling a pull in the direction of doing things with their spouse. They may feel pulled in terms of career or job situations, friends, hobbies, etc. And then there's maybe their parent who has dementia, and they're trying to look after them as well. And in situations like that, oftentimes something has to give, and a person may end up feeling guilty because they can't do it all. It may be tricky as well, even to accept that caregiver label. I found that didn't really work for me at first. It took me some time for me to get used to calling myself a caregiver. And I had a sense that I was only doing what a son would do. And many other people feel that way. You're just doing what's kind of expected and normal. But we do know that in the caregiver role with people with dementia, there are a lot of stresses involved. It is difficult. And so we can give ourselves permission to accept that label and not feel guilty that we're calling ourselves caregivers. Guilt can come from feeling sort of stuck, working too hard, and feeling like you're not making progress, you're not doing enough for the person with dementia. And we can make ourselves feel guilty and beat ourselves up over and over for things that we are unhappy about and blame ourselves for. We may feel that we're letting people down, and therefore we beat ourselves up. So what are some steps for handling guilt? We can accept first off, that the past cannot be changed. Whatever has happened is now done and over. We can instead focus on what needs to happen now and what needs to happen in the future. In other words, we can change what's going on now. We can change how we will behave in the future. We can own our feelings. In other words, saying, I'm making myself feel guilty right now. And this opens up the possibility of doing something else. I don't have to make myself feel guilty. I can instead think about what can I do in this situation rather than just make myself feel guilty. It will help if I clarify what actually I did and what I'm responsible for. Were there any other factors that fed into the situation? Were other people involved? Were other events involved that led me to do whatever I did? It can be helpful to kind of make a pie graph and figure out what size of a slice of pie you are personally responsible for and what slices are the responsibility of other people or of other events that were beyond your control. So for instance, a person with dementia getting to a point where they may be incontinent. You have no control over that whatsoever, and yet it may well be a factor in something that's happened. And so a slice of the pie would go into would be labeled with that particular issue. As we were mentioning earlier, we can use self-compassion. We need to admit that we are human. We need to recognize that we are human. And we struggle, just like other people struggle. Life is very difficult at times, and we need to be gentle and kind to ourselves and recognize the level of the difficulty that we're actually facing. This would then enable us to put some positive energy into the situation. Instead of just feeling guilty, we can turn that energy into something positive. There's a situation, it needs to be addressed. What are some possibilities for addressing it? Self-compassion means treating yourself as your own best friend, as we already said. We can catch ourselves when we're beating ourselves up. We can say, hold it, I don't need to do that anymore. I'm going to be gentle with myself. Beating myself up just makes things worse. We can acknowledge our own difficulty, acknowledge the pain. If we are beating ourselves up, we can kind of mentally imagine putting that on the shelf. Put that self-beration into a box, put it up on the shelf, and say, I don't need that right now. It's not helping. We can acknowledge that emotions can be overwhelming. And one of the ways that overwhelming happens is due to the way we talk to ourselves about the feelings that we're experiencing. So in other words, what we call self-talk will either increase or slowly decrease the actual feeling. We can keep feelings alive by feeding them as if we were putting sticks on a fire. So for instance, if I'm feeling guilty, I might beat myself up by saying to myself, I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have done that. I'm such an idiot. I'm a lousy person. I'm a terrible son, daughter, whatever. Those kinds of feelings will actually increase the guilt, and they don't make it any better. So we can stop and acknowledge that, hey, I'm overwhelming myself. I don't need to do that. I don't need to beat myself up. I don't need to make this worse. I can just recognize that I was feeling some guilt. I need some time to calm this guilt down and figure out what to do. In other words, let my rational brain start to weigh in and figure out some kind of productive way forward. We need to also remember that our feelings are real. They are affecting us. We're not bad for experiencing the feelings. If I feel guilty, I feel guilty. But that doesn't make me a bad person. It just makes me a human being who happens to be feeling guilty at this particular time. What are some other steps we can take? One of the things we can do is recognize that whatever we knew and whatever we were capable of in the past, whenever we did what we did, is perhaps a little different from where we're at now. In the time since the event that I feel guilty about and today, I might have learned some more things. My skills might be increased and my knowledge might be increased. And therefore, it's important for me not to judge myself as I was then by what I know now. I can just simply reflect on and accept that, well, I did what I did at the time based on what I knew at the time, based on what my skills were at the time. Now I've learned some more things. I can let go of the guilt and just simply continue to use the new skills that I have now. We can also allow ourselves to reevaluate past choices and to learn from them. We may have made promises that have led us into difficulty. If I promised that I would always look after my mom and she would stay home with me, and then things got too much, it became unsafe, it became unhealthy, what have you, I need to give myself permission to reevaluate that original decision, to recognize that it was made with the best of intent. but it was not made with full knowledge of the consequences of that decision. And so it is okay for us to reevaluate those choices. It is okay to learn from them and to make better choices today, which are safer, which are perhaps healthier, which are just simply better choices. We can also recognize that when I know better, I do better. In other words, whatever I've done in the past, I'm learning, and I'm doing things better now because I know better. And did I learn the hard way? Yeah. Much of life is learned that way. None of us were born knowing how to deal with a relative with dementia. And so it's important to recognize that it's learn the whole way through. And it's helpful to focus on the areas that we are actually doing well in. If we allow ourselves to only focus on the negative and allow that to outweigh the positives that we are doing, then we're making a big mistake. We do need a balance. We need to recognize that there are things we are doing that we might feel guilty about that we want to change, but we are also doing a tremendous amount of positive things as well. So it's helpful to have some kind of a mental balance regarding those two aspects. Where am I doing well? Maybe even make a list of all those things that you're doing well. And you might have a list with 20 things on it. And then on the negative side, there's just this one thing. The brain is quite capable of doing something called negative bias. And a negative bias means that you focus on the negative. And it's just the way our brains can operate sometimes. It is helpful to catch ourselves and say, no, I don't need to do that. I don't need to just stay on the negative. Let me carry a more balanced view of how I'm doing. Handling guilt is also made easier when we decide that we're going to make our decisions based on love instead of guilt. If I am going to see somebody in the nursing home because I feel guilty that if I don't go, I'll feel guilty. Well, that's going to leave me feeling kind of yucky about going. But if I decide to go because I love the person, that's going to work a lot better for me, and I'll have a better experience with that person. Guilt can be dealt with by using forgiveness. We can forgive ourselves, and if it's possible and reasonable to make amends to the person we've harmed, then do so. But remember, life is a journey, and we're learning as we go. So we'll talk about a couple of scenarios, and then there's a few questions that we'll handle. So the first one is, I snapped at my wife recently. She'd lost the car keys. They're very expensive to replace. So this is a gentleman whose wife has been dealing with early dementia, and he's snapped at her. We need to recognize that there are other factors involved. It would be helpful for him. He's feeling guilty for snapping at her, but he needs to recognize that she is changing, and he feels deep down some fear. He's probably feeling some grief that she's changing, some worry about the future, perhaps some financial worries. Is he worried that she won't be able to drive anymore? Is he worried that she's going to drive somewhere and get lost or get in an accident? And these are all feelings that are underneath the anger that he showed to her. So he can be gentle with himself about this and recognize how deeply he is actually feeling in that situation. The second one, I promised Dad I'd never put him in a home, and now I feel too uncomfortable to visit him there. So this is a person who's feeling guilty about having had to make a new decision and actually put Dad into a home. So it would be important, as we were talking about earlier, to give myself permission to make a new decision based on new information, based on changes that I could not reasonably foresee. I didn't really know how it was going to work out. I didn't really know how much help Dad would actually need. And it's best for all of us if Dad is in the home. So I can arm myself with that way of thinking, and I go to see Dad because I love him. And if I start to feel guilt, I'll just let it build and then pass. I'll just keep breathing. I don't have to make myself continue to feel guilty. I'll just recognize that it's an old habit and it just has to pass. I do to take a few breaths, and then I'll feel okay. I'll carry on with my visit. Some questions that have been raised. My family doesn't understand my guilt. How can I make them understand? We can't guarantee that you can make other people understand your guilt. But if you are able to understand it yourself, what it's stemming from, and if you were to have some kind of a family meeting and explain to them that you wish to share some important information about how you're coping, that would probably help. It's sometimes we surprise family members with things, we blurt them out, and that might be okay, but sometimes it's good to have a family meeting and just talk about how everybody is feeling, and to recognize that your guilt is your own. You're not blaming them for how you ending up feeling. There may be things they're doing that you find difficult, and it would be helpful for you to share that A, you find those things difficult, and B, what would you rather they do instead? And that is going to be more of a problem-solving stance, and it will work better for you. The next question, people keep telling me to take a break, but I'd feel too guilty. I feel like I should be doing something more productive. The key word here is should. Should and guilt are linked. And I encourage people to only use should very carefully and sparingly. That word does trigger us. And so I would suggest that this person needs to work on allowing him or herself to take a break, to say, I'm only human. I don't have to set standards for myself that are unrealistic. I can give myself permission to take a break and do something that's good for me. I don't have to work 100% of the time. The next one, I feel guilty now that Dad's in long-term care. I can't visit him. How can I support him? This, of course, is due to the COVID problem. So feeling guilty is understandable, and it should be something we can turn into a more positive avenue. In other words, what are the ways that I can possibly support him via phoning, video links, writing letters, waving outside the window, all of the things that are there for us to do. And we can recognize that the guilt in this case is connected to grief, that you cannot visit the person and you're grieving the loss of that relationship. This is hard, and we can just recognize that. So we need to sort of support ourselves as well emotionally with the difficulty that we're facing in this situation. I think we've talked enough about the putting someone in a home. Oh yes, I feel terrible because I resent having to take care of my father. After all, we never had a great relationship. So feeling badly or guilty because you resent somebody can motivate you to take a different tack. The resentment may be covering up all sorts of old harms and hurts, but there may also be some hope that maybe there's some potential for the relationship to actually improve. And so one could get in touch with that sense of hope and see if that's real, because that allows a person to think about, my father isn't quite the same person he always was. He's changed. He's a person with dementia now. And maybe there is a chance now for a new relationship. The last one, how would I know if my emotions are too much and I should seek help? If you find yourself repeating certain experiences, getting angry, and trouble is arising out of that and it's not getting resolved, if you're feeling depressed and you're finding it hard to carry the load, then, or if you're feeling overly anxious and this is inhibiting you in having a life, I would say in those kinds of situations, seek some help, talk to a professional, and they can assist you in getting, in finding a way forward. So I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and I wish you well in your roles as caregivers.